Feeling classic.
Hey everybody, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Classics Week continues with a review of the Marvin Gaye album, What's Going On. Marvin Gaye is unquestionably one of the greatest and most influential soul singers to have ever lived. The dude spent most of his life in the music business, singing, writing, doing session drumming as well, and a lot of his early career was spent singing soul, pop, doo-wop, standards, and he churned out some hits that are still widely celebrated today, like How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, and what's probably the most famous cover of Heard It Through the Grapevine. He also put out a handful of very notable duet records with soul singer Tammy Terrell, one of which featured the most popular version of Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Now, in the latter half of Marvin's career, he kind of strengthened his image as a sex symbol by dealing in the funkier and smoother side of soul, which dominated the 70s. Tracks like Let's Get It On, I Want You, and one of his last hits, Sexual Healing. But these two sections of Marvin's career are separated by this album. And this year just so happens to mark the 40th anniversary of this LP too. For Marvin, this record was a huge change in sound, in subject matter, and in the amount of control he had over the music he was making. He deviated from his usual Motown sound to make what is his most widely known album. And it's funny that this record is the one in his discography that is the biggest and considered to be the most untouchable. I'm just saying the general public usually prefers its music to be a bit more blissful. But you've got to consider that this record came out in the 70s, which wasn't exactly the brightest spot in American history. You had the Vietnam War going on, Nixon was in office, there were all sorts of protests, feminists and environmentalists were gaining ground in the mainstream. It was a time when people, most of which I'm sure were the young music-buying public, saw the world around them and they didn't like the way it looked, and they wanted some kind of way to change it. And What's Going On just seems like an appropriate soundtrack for that. The album opens up with the title track and the first single from this LP, and it really kind of sets the lyrical stage for this LP, promoting love, togetherness, and a really strong anti-war message. And it focuses on the way all this turmoil affects individual people, brothers, mothers, sisters, fathers. Marvin Gaye really tries to make listeners connect with what's going on by kind of bringing this family aspect into the lyrics. And in most cases, something like this would just hit me as corny. I think maybe it's a decent critique to say this album is pretty corny sometimes. That's how I felt about it at first. But Marvin, to me, just comes across so positive and sincere in what he's saying. And the production just makes the world that Marvin is sending this message from seem so heavenly and beautiful. It kind of makes me want to be a part of it. I feel this way about the entire album, but I think this song specifically cleanses the soul. If somebody really listens to it, I think it has the potential to just tear every shred of hate out of a person. You can call me a dirty hippie with bad facial hair if you want, but I think the world would be a lot better off if more people took the message behind this song to heart. Now, the sound of this track, the sound of this album, to me, is stellar. Usually, I'm not so much into really arranged and string-kissed pop and soul music, but the strings just are worked into this album so well, and the grooves move along really fluidly. Most of my issues with tracks that are really heavily arranged is that the groove kind of gets lost in the mess. On here, the grooves stay intact. There's this vast atmospheric reverb on Marvin Gaye's vocals. They're very soothing background vocals as well. There are warm, nimble bass lines all over this album, as well as very light hand percussion too. Lots of finger snaps, like I said, these very honey-flavored string arrangements. There are smooth saxophone flourishes interjecting on one song after another, And then there's Marvin's vocal. He's the cherry on top. He's got such a strong voice, just so much strength in every part of his range, just so much control, passion, charisma, and all of his vocal improvs throughout these tracks really add to the album for me too. The first track just kind of quickly segues into the second track. A lot of the tracks on this album just kind of flow into one another without a barrier in between. And I like that a lot. It makes the second track on here kind of feel like part two of the first, because it does deal in a lot of the same feelings and lyrical subject matters that the first track does, but it's kind of sung from the standpoint of a soldier who's just come home from war. And it's pretty funny how 40 years later a lot of the messages on this LP are still pretty relevant. Marvin drifts away from this portrait of a soldier to pull out a track on the third song that deals with drug addiction on Flying High. And that song just takes an interesting turn of mood as it just kind of segues into Save the Children, which is a pretty self-explanatory song title. Definitely the corniest moment on here, but I think the track beautifully packages the argument, the idea that we should live today thinking about how the world will look tomorrow, because the next generation is going to have to live in it. Now what's interesting is that two tracks on the album, God Is Love and Holy Holy, kind of reveal the feelings, the sentiments behind this album as being kind of religiously inspired. It re-preaches all of these ideas of love and togetherness, but from a religious standpoint. And the song Mercy, Mercy Me kind of attacks things from an environmental angle. Now overall, What's Going On has a really solid sound and style going for it. It doesn't really vary all that much from the idea of soul. It doesn't change up its instrumentation a whole lot. There is one notable change in sound on here though, and it's the 7-minute track Right On, which has a very Latin flavor to its rhythm section and piano chords. I can't really say much else about this record other than I give it a really high recommendation. It's just a really fantastic piece of soul, a seminal record for the genre. It's uplifting, it's positive, it's a righteous record, it's very feel-good, it's well performed, well recorded, well written. I can't really think of anything that I personally take issue with on here. I mean, yeah, I could totally agree with you or understand where you're coming from if this record is too sweet for you, maybe it's a little too slick, overproduced. I personally am not much of a religious person, so maybe I don't completely relate to when this album goes down that road, but I think the messages behind this LP are something that even a secular person can get behind. I'm going to leave it at that. What do you guys think of this record? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Have you heard it? Is it one of your faves? Does this record speak to you? Or is it just kind of too... Calcichesta, really quick. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? Forever.